Ashoka, also known as Asoka and popularly remembered as Ashoka the Great, was the emperor of Magadha from around 268 BC until his death in 232 BC. He was the third ruler of the Mauryan dynasty, and his empire encompassed much of the Indian subcontinent, extending from present-day Afghanistan in the west to Bangladesh in the east, with its capital at Pataliputra. A devoted patron of Buddhism, he played a decisive role in spreading the faith across Asia. According to his own inscriptions, during his 8th year as ruler, around 260 BC, Ashoka waged a brutal war to conquer Kalinga. Deeply affected by the destruction, he turned towards the practice and promotion of dharma, or righteous conduct, which became the central theme of his edicts. Buddhist traditions credit him with building numerous stupas, supporting the Third Buddhist Council, encouraging missionary activity, and donating generously to the monastic community. For centuries, Ashoka's existence as a historical emperor was nearly forgotten. It was only with the 19th century decipherment of Brahmi inscriptions that his legacy became clear. Today, he is regarded as one of India's greatest emperors. The national emblem of modern India is derived from his lion capital, and the Ashoka chakra, a wheel symbolizing law and righteousness, appears at the center of the Indian flag. Knowledge about Ashoka comes from several sources: his own inscriptions, later inscriptions that mention him, and ancient literature, especially Buddhist texts. These accounts often differ, but historians have worked to reconcile their evidence. His inscriptions are the earliest examples of imperial self-representation in India, although they focus almost entirely on Dhamma and reveal little about the broader workings of the Mauryan state. Scholars often view them as political messages meant to portray Ashoka and his administration in the best light rather than objective historical records. Other inscriptions from later centuries, such as those at Junagadh, as well as uncertain references from sites like Sirkap, may also preserve echoes of his reign. Some additional records, such as the Sogaura copper plate and the Mahasthan inscription, have been tentatively linked to his time. A large part of the Ashoka narrative is preserved in Buddhist legends. These accounts, composed in later centuries by Buddhist writers, depict him as an ideal ruler shaped by the faith. Because they were written long after his reign, historians treat them with caution as they mix history with religious storytelling. They exist in many languages, including Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, Burmese, Khmer, Sinhala, Thai, Lao, and Khotanese. All can be traced to two main traditions, one from North India, preserved in texts such as the Divyavadana and in Chinese works, and another from Sri Lanka, preserved in Pali texts such as the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa. The two traditions often differ in emphasis. The Sri Lankan version highlights Ashoka's role in convening the Third Buddhist Council and sending missionaries abroad, including his son Mahinda's mission to Sri Lanka. The North Indian version does not mention these events, but instead tells stories, such as those of another son named Kunala. Even when both traditions tell similar stories, they vary in details. For example, both agree that Ashoka's queen Tisharakshita attacked the Bodhi tree. In the North Indian account, she later healed the tree after regretting her actions, while in the Sri Lankan account, the tree was permanently destroyed, though a branch had already been transplanted to Sri Lanka. Likewise, in one story, Ashoka's attempt to claim a relic of the Buddha at Ramagrama fails. In the North Indian version, he is outdone by the devotion of the Nagas who guard it, while in the Sri Lankan version, the Buddha had destined the relic for enshrinement by a future Sri Lankan king. These variations reflect how Buddhist traditions used Ashoka's story to emphasize their own cultural and religious ideals, with the Sri Lankan tradition in particular presenting the island as the new stronghold of Buddhism. Numismatic, sculptural, and archaeological evidence provides additional insight into Ashoka's reign. His name appears in lists of Mauryan rulers found in the Puranas, but these texts, written by Brahmanical authors who were not favored by the Mauryan court, give few details about him. Other works, such as the Arthashastra and the Indica of Megasthenes, offer more general information about the Mauryan period and can be used to make inferences about Ashoka. However, the Arthashastra is primarily a treatise describing an ideal state rather than a historical record, and its exact date remains debated. The Indica itself has been lost, and is known only through later paraphrases. A 12th century text from Kashmir, the Rajatarangini, speaks of a king Ashoka of the Gonandiya dynasty who built stupas. Some scholars, including Aurel Stein, identified him with the Mauryan emperor, while others, such as Ananda W. P. Guruj, argue this is inaccurate. The edicts attributed to Ashoka appear under two main titles. Some are issued in the name of Piyadasi or Devanampiya Piyadasi, meaning beloved of the gods and gracious of Mian, and include the major rock and major pillar edicts. Others are issued in the name of Ashoka, or as Devanampiya alone, and include the minor rock and minor pillar edicts. The different geographical distribution and content of these inscriptions has led to debate. A controversial theory proposed by Christopher Beckwith suggests that Piyadasi and Ashoka were in fact different rulers. According to this view, Piyadasi, whom Greek sources call Amitrochates, was a son of Chandragupta Maurya, who ruled a vast empire in the 3rd century BC. His inscriptions promoted piety, but made no mention of Buddhism, the Buddha, or the monastic community, except for one reference that Beckwith considers spurious. In contrast, Ashoka was argued to be a later king, ruling in the 1st or 2nd century CE, whose inscriptions were fewer in number, confined to central India, and of lower quality, but which did promote Buddhism explicitly. This interpretation, however, has been strongly criticized by other scholars, and mainstream historians reject it as implausible. Ashoka is known by several names and titles. The name Ashoka literally means without sorrow, and according to legend, his mother chose it because his birth relieved her of suffering. Another name associated with him is Priyadasi, meaning he who looks with kindness, which may have been a regnal title. Greek inscriptions use the form Basileus Piodasis. His inscriptions also regularly use the title Devanampiya, meaning beloved of the gods. The identification of Devanampiya with Ashoka is firmly established by inscriptions such as those at Maski and Gujara, where both names appear together. This title was also adopted by other rulers, including the Sri Lankan king Devanampiya Tissa and Ashoka's descendant Dasharatha Maurya. The precise date of Ashoka's birth is uncertain, but his inscriptions mention several Hellenistic rulers, including Antiochus II Theos, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Antigonus II Gonatas, Magas of Cyrene, and Alexander, either of Epirus or Corinth. Since these kings are known from external sources, Ashoka must have lived in the 3rd century BC. He is generally thought to have been born around 304 BC and to have taken the throne in 269 or 268 BC. He was probably born in Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital. Archaeological excavations in modern Patna have revealed remains of the city dating to that period. Ashoka's inscriptions do not describe his ancestry, but other sources, such as the Puranas and the Sri Lankan chronicle Mahavamsa, state that his father was the Mauryan emperor Bindusara and his grandfather was Chandragupta, the founder of the empire. The Ashokavadana also names Bindusara as his father, but traces Ashoka's ancestry back to King Bimbisara of Magadha through several generations. In contrast, a later account by the Tibetan monk Taranatha describes Ashoka as the son of King Namita of Champarana and the daughter of a merchant, though this version is regarded as a distorted retelling. According to the Ashokavadana, his mother was the daughter of a Brahmin from Champa who was prophesied to marry a king. She was brought to Pataliputra, where she became Bindusara's chief queen. While the Ashokavadana does not give her name, other traditions do. Some call her Subhadrangi, while others name her Dharma or Dhamma, identifying her as belonging to the Maurya clan. Another account describes her as Janapada Kalyani, a title interpreted by some scholars not as a name, but as an epithet, meaning ornament of the realm. Some historians have speculated that Ashoka's mother or grandmother may have been of Greek descent, pointing to the marital alliance between Chandragupta and the Seleucid king Seleucus I. However, there is no direct evidence to support this, and most modern scholars dismiss the theory. Ashoka's own inscriptions are silent about his early life, and much of what is known comes from later legends written centuries after his time. These stories often contain imaginative details, such as accounts of Ashoka's previous lives, but they also preserve fragments that may reflect genuine historical traditions. According to the Ashoka Vedana, Ashoka was disliked by his father Bindusara because of his rough and unattractive skin. One day, Bindusara asked the ascetic Pingala Vatsajiva to determine which of his sons was fit to succeed him. The ascetic advised that all the princes gather in the garden of the Golden Pavilion. Ashoka hesitated to go, knowing his father's dislike, but his mother persuaded him to attend. Minister Radhagupta, seeing Ashoka leaving the capital, offered him a royal elephant for the journey. At the garden, the ascetic examined the princes and realized Ashoka was destined to be emperor. To avoid angering Bindusara, he refused to name the successor directly. Instead, he declared that the one who possessed the best mount, seat, drink, vessel, and food would become king. Each time, Ashoka claimed the distinction. Later, Pingala Vatsajiva privately told Ashoka's mother of his destiny and, on her advice, departed the realm to avoid Bindusara's wrath. Although legends claim Bindusara disliked Ashoka's appearance, they also state that he entrusted him with serious responsibilities, such as suppressing a rebellion at Taxila or governing Ujjain. This suggests that despite personal dislike, Bindusara valued Ashoka's abilities. Another possibility is that he sent Ashoka to distant provinces to keep him away from the court. One story relates that Bindusara sent Ashoka to quell a rebellion at Taxila, an important city in Gandhara. Ashoka is said to have marched there with a fourfold army, but no weapons, which miraculously appeared when he declared his worthiness to rule. When he reached the city, the people welcomed him, claiming their revolt was against corrupt ministers, not the king. Later, the people of Kasa received him similarly, and the gods proclaimed that he would one day conquer the world. While no contemporary records mention a Taxila revolt or Ashoka's presence there, an Aramaic inscription found at Sirkap near Taxila contains the name Priyadarshi, a title used by Ashoka, lending some support to the legend. The Dharmarajika stupa near Taxila may also connect him to the region, its name suggesting it was built under his patronage. Sri Lankan tradition instead states that Bindusara appointed Ashoka as viceroy of Ujjain, a major province in central India. This account is supported by the Saru-Maru inscription, which records a visit by Ashoka while still a prince, and by Ashoka's own edicts, which mention a royal viceroy in Ujjain. On his journey there, he is said to have stopped in Vidisha, where he met and fell in love with Devi, the daughter of a merchant. Later traditions describe her as Vidisha Mahadevi of the Shakya clan, linking Ashoka's family to that of the Buddha. Devi bore Ashoka a son, Mahinda, and a daughter, Sanghamita. According to tradition, Mahinda became a Buddhist monk at the age of 20 during the 6th year of Ashoka's reign, which suggests that Ashoka must have been in his 30s when he ascended the throne, having spent several years as viceroy. The question of Ashoka's succession is surrounded by conflicting legends. The Ashoka Vedana tells that his elder brother Susima once offended a minister who then resolved to support Ashoka's claim to the throne, believing him destined to be a universal ruler. When Taxila rebelled again, Susima was sent to subdue it, but failed. At the same time, Bindusara fell gravely ill. While Susima was away, the ministers urged Bindusara to install Ashoka as temporary king. Though Bindusara resisted, Ashoka proclaimed that if the throne was truly his, the gods would grant it to him, and, according to the legend, they did. When Susuma returned, Ashoka's minister Radhagupta lured him into a pit of burning charcoal, where he died. Other traditions, such as the Mahavamsa, state that when Bindusara died, Ashoka seized Pataliputra, killed his eldest brother, and ascended the throne. Some texts claim that he massacred 99 of his half-brothers, while others give the number as 100. Only one brother, named variously as Tissa, Vitashoka, Vigatashoka, Sudatta, or Sugatra, is said to have survived. These large figures are clearly exaggerations meant to emphasize the bloodshed, but they suggest that Ashoka eliminated rivals to secure the throne. Later writers, such as Taranatha, even describe him as an illegitimate son who killed legitimate heirs to claim power. While Buddhist texts portray Ashoka as cruel and violent before his conversion, his own inscriptions present a more restrained picture. One of his rock edicts refers to officials assigned to care for the families of his brothers and sisters, which implies that some of his siblings survived his rise to power. Scholars continue to debate the extent of the killings, but it is likely that the later legends exaggerated his ruthlessness to highlight the contrast between Ashoka's early reign and his later devotion to Buddhism. According to the Sri Lankan chronicles Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, Ashoka ascended the throne 218 years after the death of the Buddha and ruled for 37 years. The date of the Buddha's death itself is debated, and North Indian tradition claims that Ashoka ruled around a century after it, which complicates the chronology further. If the Sri Lankan tradition is correct, and the Buddha died in 483 BC, Ashoka's accession would fall around 265 BC. The Puranas, however, state that Bindusara ruled for 25 years rather than the 28 years given in the Sri Lankan accounts, which would shift Ashoka's accession back to 268 BC. Another possibility arises if the Buddha's death is placed at 486 BC, as preserved in the Cantonese dotted record, which also results in Ashoka's ascension being dated to 268 BC. The Mahavamsa adds that Ashoka consecrated himself as emperor 4 years after becoming sovereign, a delay which may indicate a war of succession with other princes. One story in the Ashoka Vedana recounts how his minister Yashas once covered the sun with his hand, which the historian P.H.L. Egermont interpreted as a reference to the solar eclipse of the 4th of May, 249 BC, visible in northern India. The same text describes Ashoka undertaking a pilgrimage to Buddhist sites shortly afterward. His Ramande pillar inscription records his visit to Lumbini in his 21st regnal year. And if this visit is linked to the pilgrimage, then a coronation date of 268 to 269 BC becomes likely. However, not all scholars accept this interpretation. John S. Strong, for example, argues that the story of Yashas was never meant as a chronological clue, and Egermont's theory ignores the literary and religious symbolism of the tale. Both the Sri Lankan and North Indian traditions describe Ashoka as cruel before his conversion to Buddhism. Tibetan sources even say he was first known as Kamashoka for his indulgence in pleasures, then as Chandashoka, the fierce Ashoka for his violent acts, and only later as Dhammashoka, the righteous Ashoka, after he embraced Buddhism. The Ashoka Vedana records his reputation as Chandashoka and attributes to him many cruel acts. It tells how he once ordered his ministers to cut down every fruit-bearing tree. When they refused, he beheaded 500 of them himself. In another tale, after concubines mocked his rough skin, they destroyed branches of his beloved Ashoka tree while he slept. On waking, he burned 500 of them alive. His prime minister, alarmed by such brutality, advised appointing an executioner to handle future killings so that the king's hands would not be stained. A youth named Garika was chosen, boasting that he could execute the whole world. Ashoka built him a prison in Pataliputra known as Ashoka's Hell, which appeared pleasant from the outside but was a place of brutal torture inside. Chinese accounts written centuries later describe Ashoka personally studying the torments of the underworld to devise his methods, and Xuanzang reported seeing a pillar that marked the site of Ashoka's hell. The Mahavamsa also notes his reputation for cruelty, saying he was first called Chandashoka because of his wickedness, but later Dharmashoka for his piety. Unlike the northern traditions, however, the Sri Lankan texts do not describe specific acts of brutality beyond the tale of his slaughter of brothers during his rise to power. Most historians regard these depictions as exaggerations by Buddhist authors who wish to dramatize the transformation that Buddhism brought to him. By contrasting his supposed viciousness with his later righteousness, they emphasized the miraculous impact of his conversion. The Kalinga War was a turning point. Ashoka's inscriptions state that he conquered Kalinga in his 8th year on the throne. The destruction, death, and deportations filled him with remorse, and in the years afterward, he increasingly embraced Buddhism. In Major Rock Edict 13, Ashoka expresses his sorrow, saying that conquest brings slaughter and suffering, which caused him deep regret, and from that moment he dedicated himself to the law of piety. Sri Lankan tradition tells a different story, asserting that Ashoka was already a Buddhist by his 4th year of rule, and built 84,000 monasteries between his 5th and 7th years, making no mention of the Kalinga campaign. On this basis, some historians believe he converted before the war. Others argue that if he had been a Buddhist, he would not have waged such a devastating campaign, though some suggest he may have had his own interpretation of the middle way. Earlier accounts often presented his conversion as a dramatic moment caused by the horrors of Kalinga, but the inscriptions show it was more gradual. A minor rock edict issued in his 13th year, 5 years after the campaign, says he had been a lay Buddhist for over 2 years, but had only recently begun to progress in his devotion, drawing closer to the Sangha and becoming more ardent in his practice. According to Ashoka's Major Rock Edict 13, he conquered Kalinga in his 8th year as ruler. The inscription records that during the war, 100,000 people and animals were killed in battle, many more perished in other ways, and 150,000 were carried away as captives. Ashoka wrote that the immense suffering caused him deep remorse, leading him to devote himself to the practice and promotion of dharma. He declared that the slaughter, death, and deportation of a conquered people were painful and deplorable, and that the suffering of religious communities and householders was even more distressing. This edict was carved at several locations, including Eragudi, Girnar, Kalsi, Maneshra, Shabasgarhi, and Kandahar. However, in the Kalinga region itself, the edict does not appear. There, the 13th and 14th rock edicts were replaced with alternative inscriptions that omit any mention of Ashoka's repentance. It is possible that Ashoka did not think it wise to admit remorse before the very people he had conquered. Another possibility is that the descriptions of the war and its consequences were exaggerated or partly imagined, intended to impress audiences far away from Kalinga who could not verify the truth. No ancient source describes further military campaigns by Ashoka. Much later, the 16th century writer Taranatha claimed that he conquered the entire Indian subcontinent, though this is not supported by contemporary evidence. Accounts of Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism differ. Sri Lankan tradition records that his father Bindusara followed Brahmanism, while his mother Dharma was a devotee of the Ajivikas. For the first 3 years of his reign, Ashoka is said to have supported non-Buddhist sects. The Samantapasadika describes him as being dissatisfied with the conduct of the Brahmins who received his alms, and neither the Ajivika nor the Nagantha teachers introduced to him could satisfy him. The Dipavamsa says that Ashoka gathered religious leaders at his court, showered them with gifts, and asked them to answer a certain question. None succeeded. One day, he encountered a young Buddhist monk named Nigroda, who was seeking alms in Pataliputra. Nigroda was Ashoka's nephew, the son of Ashoka's elder brother, Sumana, who had been killed during the struggle for the throne, though Ashoka did not know this at the time. Ashoka was impressed by the monk's calm and fearless presence and asked him to explain his faith. Nigroda preached to him about earnestness, and Ashoka was so moved that he offered him generous gifts, including 400,000 silver coins and 8 daily portions of rice. From this time, Ashoka became a lay follower of Buddhism and began visiting the Kukutarama monastery in Pataliputra. There, he met the elder Moggalliputta Tissa, who deepened his commitment to the Buddhist path. Some scholars suggest that this legend was meant to explain why Ashoka embraced Buddhism rather than Jainism, which also preached nonviolence and compassion. The story portrays him as seeking not just a doctrine, but a wise and competent teacher. Sri Lankan tradition also states that in his 6th year as king, his son Mahinda became a Buddhist monk, and his daughter Sanghamita became a Buddhist nun. Other traditions give different accounts. The Divivadana describes his conversion through the monk Samudra, a former merchant imprisoned in Ashoka's terrible jail known as Ashoka's Hell. Samudra saved himself with miraculous powers and astonished the king, who then became a Buddhist. Another story describes a young boy who impressed Ashoka and supposedly performed miracles, even subduing hostile Brahmins, after which Ashoka turned to Buddhism. By Ashoka's time, Buddhist communities already existed in many parts of India, and it is uncertain which branch most influenced him. However, the Sangha in Pataliputra and the community at Mahabodhi are both likely candidates. His major rock edict 8 records that he visited the Bodhi tree in his 10th year as king, and by his 13th year, inscriptions confirm that he had become a committed Buddhist. After embracing Buddhism, Ashoka became famous for his construction projects. Both the Mahavamsa and the Ashokavadana credit him with building 84,000 stupas or monasteries. The Ashokavadana claims he collected relics of the Buddha, divided them into thousands of portions, and had them enshrined across the land. The Mahavamsa tells a similar story, but states that he built monasteries to match the 84,000 sections of the Dharma. Among the monuments credited to him are the Great Stupa at Sanchi, the Dhammic Stupa at Sarnath, the Mahabodhi Temple at Bodh Gaya, the Barabar Caves in Bihar, and others across India and beyond. His edicts also show that during his reign, Ashoka sponsored extensive welfare measures. He established facilities for medical treatment of both people and animals, planted medicinal herbs, dug wells, and planted trees along roads. These activities extended into neighboring lands, including the kingdoms of the Cholas, Pandyas, and even Hellenistic realms. By his 12th year as king, he began to have his policies carved into stone inscriptions. He appointed special officers, the Dharma Mahamatras, to oversee moral conduct and welfare. The Sri Lankan tradition also describes his role in purifying the Buddhist Sangha. Lavish patronage had attracted impostors, and disputes paralyzed the order. Ashoka sought the advice of Moggalliputta Tissa, who helped him expel false monks. The Great Council that followed, known as the Third Buddhist Council, is said to have been convened in his 17th year. There, texts were compiled and orthodoxy reaffirmed. North Indian traditions, however, do not mention this event, which has led some to question its historicity, though Ashoka's own inscriptions do show concern for the unity and purity of the Sangha. According to Sri Lankan tradition, Ashoka also supported the spread of Buddhism abroad. Missions were sent to regions such as Kashmir, Gandhara, the Himalayas, Western India, Sri Lanka, and even as far as Suvarnabhumi, often identified with Southeast Asia. His son Mahinda is said to have led the mission to Sri Lanka, and his daughter Sanghamita later traveled there with a branch of the Bodhi tree to establish an order of nuns. Some scholars doubt these stories, as Ashoka's own inscriptions do not record them. But archaeological evidence suggests that Buddhist missions were indeed active, and some of the monks named in the legends are attested in early relic inscriptions. Although Buddhist texts portray Ashoka as entirely peaceful after his conversion, some legends, particularly in the Ashokavadana, describe him as continuing acts of violence. They claim he executed heretics by the thousands, persecuted Ajivikas and Jains, and even caused the death of his own brother. These stories, however, are widely regarded by historians as sectarian propaganda rather than fact, since Jain texts that mention Ashoka do not describe such events. Reliefs from Sanchi and Kanaganahalli depict an emperor with his empresses in attendance, and scholars generally identify the figure as Ashoka. One relief shows him with Asandamitra and Karuvaki, while another shows him with Tisharakshita, both accompanied by attendants carrying royal emblems. Another relief at Sanchi portrays him with Queen Devi, also called Shakyakumari, at the Deer Park. Different traditions mention 5 consorts of Ashoka: Devi, also known as Vidisha Mahadevi Shakyakumari, Asandamitra, Padmavati, Karuvaki, and Tisharakshita. Karuvaki is the only one mentioned in Ashoka's own inscriptions. The Allahabad Pillar Edict records her as the mother of his son Tavara and acknowledges her religious and charitable donations. Some scholars suggest that Tisharakshita may have been another name for Karuvaki. The Sri Lankan chronicle Mahavamsa states that Ashoka's chief empress was Asandamitra, who died 4 years before him. Her position as empress was explained through legends of her merit in a previous life when she guided a Pratyeka Buddha to a honey merchant, who later became Ashoka. Other accounts say she also gave the monk a piece of cloth, and that her spiritual merit explained her good fortune. Later texts, including Cambodian and Thai traditions, tell stories of a miraculous procurement of 60,000 robes for monks and her ability to prove her superiority over Ashoka's other wives. Some accounts even claim that Asandamitra encouraged Ashoka to adopt Buddhism and to build 84,000 stupas and monasteries. After Asandamitra's death, the Mahavamsa states that Tisaraka became the chief empress. The Ashokavadana refers to her as Tisharakshita and tells a story of her jealousy and cruelty. Another empress, Padmavati, is mentioned in the Divyavadana as the mother of Ashoka's son Kunala. As a prince in central India, Ashoka fell in love with Devi of Vidisha, who chose to remain in her city rather than join him in the capital. The Sri Lankan tradition says their relationship was one of close companionship, though not necessarily formal marriage. Their children were Mahinda and Sangamita, both of whom became important figures in the spread of Buddhism. Among his sons, Tivara, the child of Karuvaki, is the only one named in Ashoka's inscriptions. North Indian traditions mention another son, Kunala, who later had a son named Samprati. The Sri Lankan chronicles emphasize Mahinda, who became a Buddhist missionary to Sri Lanka, while Chinese sources sometimes describe Mahinda as Ashoka's brother rather than his son. The Divyavadana describes Kunala, also called Dharmavivardhana, as crown prince and governor of Gandhara. The Kashmiri chronicle Rajatarangini mentions a son named Jalauka. Sangamita, Ashoka's daughter by Devi, according to Sri Lankan tradition, became a nun and carried a sapling of the Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka. Some historians, however, doubt her historicity because of the unusual meaning of her name and the improbability of her marriage and ordination as described in the texts. Another daughter named Charumati is said to have married a Kshatriya noble named Devapala. Ashoka's elder half-brother Susima appears in northern traditions, while Sri Lankan sources call his brother Tisa, who later renounced the world and became an enlightened monk. Other traditions mention a brother named Vitashoka, who also became an arhat. The Chinese pilgrim Faxian refers to a younger brother named Mahendra, who turned to ascetic life after being reprimanded by Ashoka. The Ashokavadana tells of a brother killed by mistake during Ashoka's persecution of rival sects. The empire under Ashoka was vast. Building on the conquest of his grandfather Chandragupta and his father Bindusara, Ashoka ruled nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. His inscriptions suggest that the southernmost regions were ruled by the Cholas, Pandyas, Kerala-putras, and Satyaputras, while in the northwest, his authority reached into Afghanistan, bordering the Seleucid Empire. The capital was Pataliputra in Magadha. Ashoka's inscriptions make it clear that he was a lay follower of Buddhism. He refers to himself as an upasaka and as a follower of the Buddha and the Sangha. His edicts record pilgrimages to the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, to Lumbini, the Buddha's birthplace, and to stupas dedicated to earlier Buddhas. His interest in maintaining the unity of the Sangha is evident in several inscriptions. At the same time, Ashoka promoted tolerance of all religions. His edicts praise both Brahmins and Shamanas, forbid sectarian conflict, and record donations to different groups, including the Ajivikas. He dedicated the Barabar caves to Ajivika ascetics, exempted Lumbini from taxes in honor of the Buddha, and enlarged stupas dedicated to past Buddhas. He established the office of Dhamma Mahamatas to oversee the welfare of religious communities as well as the poor, women, and children. For Ashoka, dharma was a universal moral code rather than strictly Buddhist teaching. His inscriptions describe it as righteousness, social concern, religious tolerance, compassion for animals, and rejection of unnecessary warfare. He limited animal sacrifice, abolished royal hunting, and promoted veterinary care. He also ordered trees to be planted, wells dug, and rest houses built along roads. He restricted animal slaughter even in the palace kitchens. These policies have led some to see his reign as one of the earliest examples of state concern for environmental and animal welfare. Ashoka sent emissaries to distant lands, spreading his idea of conquest through dharma. His edicts name the Greek rulers Antiochus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magus, and Alexander as recipients of his messages. Evidence also suggests contact with Hellenistic ambassadors at his court. Some Greek monks are mentioned in Buddhist sources as missionaries, and Greeks are recorded as governors within Ashoka's empire. His palace at Pataliputra is thought to have been influenced by Achaemenid architecture from Persepolis. Buddhist traditions link Ashoka's greatness to acts of merit in past lives. One story from the Mahavamsa says that he gave honey to a Pratyeka Buddha, wishing to become ruler of the world. Another tale from the Ashokavadana tells of his boyhood gift of dirt to the Buddha, which was accepted as a meritorious offering. Other legends expand on these themes, linking his wives and ministers to companions from earlier lives. Ashoka's last dated inscription comes from his 26th year. Later traditions state that Asandamitra died in his 29th year, and that Tisaraka became empress in his 32nd. Legends describe her jealousy of Ashoka's devotion to the Bodhi tree, leading her to cause it harm through sorcery. Other stories tell of her attempt to seduce Kunala, Ashoka's son, and her cruel act of blinding him. Accounts differ on whether Ashoka executed her or forgave her after Kunala miraculously regained his sight. According to Sri Lankan tradition, Ashoka ruled for 37 years and died around 232 BC. The Ashokavadana tells of his final illness when he was denied access to the treasury and gave away his last personal possession, a piece of fruit, to the Buddha Sangha as his final gift. Legends say that his body burned for 7 days and nights during cremation, emphasizing his sanctity in Buddhist memory.